Thank you very much, Rafaela, Leonella and Virginia, and good evening to all my colleagues and friends. It is an honour, but also slightly confusing to be the first presenter, because as you can see, Australian homesteads are only from the 19th century. That is the villa in the rural setting. As you well know, Europeans entered a country that had already been occupied for 60,000 years. So there was a very different sort of estate. And the early settlers were called squatters. They were coming into their stations. So they arrived in basically 1788 into a stable landscape which they described as park-like, splendid open country consisting of plains and downs. But the interesting thing is the rate of human-induced change in the landscape accelerated rapidly. And in a sense, Australia experienced two revolutions, colonisation and industrialisation together. And this is a very early pastoral property, 1820s in New South Wales. It is now an agricultural college. But you can see the homestead or the villa and the outbuildings, the shearing shed, the designed landscape behind, and then the bush, as we call the natural forest. On the other hand, we had Arcadian estates, grand houses like this by accomplished architects who trained in England. And this Georgian Revival building was originally surrounded by a 54-acre garden on the foreshore of Sydney Harbour. And you can see by this painting of Conrad Martin's in 1848 that the homestead is in a very picturesque setting. It's now, as you can see from the photograph above, an inner city suburb. But colonial artists were painting successful rural estates to illustrate their wealth and the fact that they were settlers. They had no intention of going home to Europe. And here we see some examples, a very fine mansion and its design garden with a lovely prospect over Deep Creek. And again, the bottom photo shows the fields or paddocks, as we call them, and the imported stock. The owner was very proud of this and asked the artist to paint these. But successful Australian rural property owners often commissioned architect-designed mansions. And though many people were aware of Capability Brown, which is what started Leonella's interest in this in our discussions in Bath. And these houses illustrated both their wealth and their transition to permanent residence of a new country. And this is Werribee Park, set in 1,000 acres of landscape gardens and grounds southwest of Melbourne. The mansion is 1873, but by 1922 it had become a seminary for priests. And then in 1973, the government acquired the whole estate and turned the mansion into a hotel. There's an open range zoo and a rose garden. Other homesteads such as this one, Wurriwarrite, Bluestone, very typical of the Western District of Victoria, a rich pastoral area, and an influential Scottish pastoralist developed it, designed by a local architect. It's one of the largest in Western Victoria and intact and well maintained. Within the grounds there are an array of stone fences, outhouses, farmyard remnants, and surrounded by picturesque parkland. And one of the pleasures of a large farm is that space is no constraint, and each garden enjoys the benefit of large trees that frame the distant landscape views. In a sense, I think this slide illustrates many of the characteristics from a landscape architectural point of view of our rural estates. The grand mansion, the avenue, the views, the framed views out on the landscape. We can see this in the next example in Queensland, an 1840s pastoral estate, painted again by Conrad Martins in 1854 in a very romantic field, but you can see the mountains in the distance over the hedge around the design garden of the homestead. A very early 1843 house made of cedar and on the register in Queensland. Whereas this homestead, a different style, built 20 years later for an Englishman, and you can see the Gothic Revival picture book style, but the design garden with a lake and stone walls looking out upon his pastoral estate. One of the issues now is that these pastoral estates are changing in character. This one, for example, has been replaced by cotton in the last decade. The only World Heritage Site that we have, which is a rural estate, is Brickenden, and it's in a sense by default, because this wonderful landscape you can see was basically constructed by convicts. The first settlers, the Archer brothers, had 100 convicts assigned to them to manufacture this landscape. You can see here the homestead, the villa, a very classic Georgian design, and the inner gardens, the parklands, the outer gardens with the forest of fir trees, not typical of Australia. And maintenance of all this landscape today, the orchard, the stock loading yards, the extensive hedges and roads, the mature trees, all require different skills of the owner. It is convict-made sheep country. The native vegetation removed and living fences in the form of hawthorn hedges planted in the 1820s. The owners need to introduce new crops to stay viable as a farm, but any new crops must remain within this historic line of fences. And this is the sort of crop they're interested in, high-value opium poppies grown under strict government control, as in this example on another old rural estate. Elsewhere we have design gardens, this one again in Queensland, but from between the wars, a very successful and beautiful garden. But over the garden wall, their pastoral estate is now being taken up by gas mining for coal seam gas, and that is changing the pastoral landscape. Another example is when historic villas are taken over as national park units, and this one at Woodlands at Tullamarine near Melbourne Airport is one that I have been intimately associated with and written a book about this place. Here we see the prefabricated homestead imported from England in 1860 in the top left, the same homestead with the mature trees in 1890, and then it has a makeover of a Californian bungalow in 1919. But some of the same trees you can see, and then we see it in 2013. It's a very important property, one of the earliest rural estates in Victoria, 1843. And this magnolia in the courtyard in the top right is recorded as being planted in June 1843. But now that it is a parkland, it has become a recreational venue, as you can see in the bottom left, rather than a rural estate. And again, these pictures going anti-clockwise show you some of the changes. Originally, the grazing estate, still being grazed lightly in 1993 in the middle, and then you see the encroaching vegetation, the densification of vegetation, and instead of sheep and cattle, we now have kangaroos in the bottom right. But this is the objective of the National Park Service for an historic park, to restore the landscape as they see it to natural species, although retired racehorses are grazing in the front yards. We have other examples, quite a few grand homesteads, significant for their surviving outbuildings and early plantings, this one of olives and mulberry groves, representative of early agricultural industries when people were experimenting. This homestead, Bontharambo, had a magnificent avenue of English oaks which died in the drought, and they've been now replaced with Algerian oaks due to the drying weather. And this brings me to the 7 issues that I think are very relevant to our study. And I think, taking up Rafaela's question, some of these issues will be found across all sorts of rural estates. For us, one of the issues is many of them have passed out of the ownership of original families. The planning and heritage legislation, as Leonella showed, often only applies to the homestead and the immediate garden, but not the wider estate. Thirdly, owners cannot afford today a team of garden staff. Fourthly, most local government areas in Australia have taken biodiversity surveys, but they don't see the clues from the colonial garden. They don't see the exotic vegetation, only the natural. Fifthly, even in historic garden management, people are often appointed without a proper apprenticeship to some more experienced person who understands the original spirit of the garden and the rural estate in terms of its design and layout. And sixthly, changing economics and global markets have led to a change from pastoral production to higher value crops, whether it's opium or wine grapes, or even rotations of grains, which obviously alter the historic landscape. And finally, for us, climate change is very real, with less water, longer dry periods and bushfires, which are changing the longevity and sustainability of designed rural estates. I'll just now show you quickly some slides to illustrate this. Here we have the whole problem of maintenance of over-mature avenues. Here, the replacement of senescent garden plantings. So in a drought landscape, all the effort goes to keeping animals alive and the garden suffers. And you can see this garden suffered greatly and then is being replanted. New crops are coming in and replacing the traditional pastoral activities, in this case, vines. We've had a great explosion in vineyards in the better watered parts of Australia, and these are on many rural estates. And as I mentioned earlier, bushfires. Every year, a significant number of rural homesteads and their garden estates are destroyed by bushfires. We also have the issue of very beautiful homesteads with great outlooks and long drives being affected by new wind farm development. And you can see in the bottom left how tiny the sheep are against the great wind farm towers. Are there some solutions? Well, currently there has been a great boom in property values in Australia, and many wealthy entrepreneurs want both an historic homestead with a garden and a working property where they can run cattle or crops. And recent sales of historic homesteads have been to wealthy off-farm owners. And it seems these people use it firstly as a destination to visit, some for visitor accommodation to offset maintenance costs, and some for corporate retreats and functions. But my question here is this enough to keep the designed cultural landscapes of these places intact and understood? We have other solutions. For example, in Tasmania, the southern island state, there are about 3,000 kilometres of historic hawthorn hedges remaining from the 19th century. And when wire fencing developed, new roads and smaller lots were developed and many hedges pulled out. Others have just become senescent. And although they're not protected through planning legislation, you can appeal to the owners to look after them and to make them stock-proof. And here we have an example of a demonstration on one property of relaying the hedges. And this is all from a national television news item talking about the success of farmers taking up this option. And I suppose, I guess, my final suggestion, and this is a first in Australia, the state of South Australia has legislated protection for its environment and food production areas. In the 19th century, there were small farms in a designed landscape, and you can see them here in their different guises. Certainly you can see the vineyards in their autumn clothing. But this is the first time in Australia a government has come up with some protection for the designed landscape because of its food production. So I hope in my comments I've given you some idea of the grand estates with their English antecedents, and then the range of issues that we're facing in trying to maintain these as historic villas in their total rural setting. And as I said, I think we will find many issues that are common. Thank you very much.